Rape, murder and deportation. Millions in Sudan go on strike after a brutal crackdown, demanding the military relinquish power. I'm Imran Garda, and today on the Newsmakers we ask if violence will end all hope of civilian rule in Sudan. When the military deposed President Omar al-Bashir in April, bringing his 30-year grip on power to an end, thousands celebrated in the streets. Last week, those same streets ran with blood, and now the capital looks like a ghost town. Pro-democracy protesters have been demanding a transition to full civilian rule. Right now, that seems unlikely, with army officers refusing to concede power and a transitional military council that's run by the head of a brutal paramilitary force. Millions in Sudan have gone on strike, bringing Khartoum to a standstill. And the opposition says its campaign of civil disobedience will only end when the generals step down. Will they force the military's hand, or will the Sudanese people face more attacks? Haider Abbasi reports.
Silence in Sudan's capital, Khartoum. The streets have been empty since Sunday. Protesters have urged business owners and workers to stay at home. The strike is part of a campaign to pressure the army to give up power. And it began after this. A Sudanese paramilitary force attacked a sit-in protest last week. Demonstrators say 118 people were killed, but the health ministry says 61 people died, including 3 soldiers. The army has blamed the opposition for the deaths.
We will not allow chaos, and we will not go back on our convictions. There is no way back. We must impose the respect of the country by law.
In response to the violence, the African Union suspended Sudan's membership. Back in April, the military seized power after it deposed Omar al-Bashir, the leader of Sudan for nearly 30 years. He'd been facing calls to step down for months. At first, the protesters were on the same side as the military, but the demonstrators turned on the officers when they refused to hand over power to civilians. And now Khartoum is on edge.
People are in a state of great fear. All Sudanese people are uncertain. They're very afraid. People are unable to leave their houses. They're unable to go to work. They're unable to do anything. Everything is on hold.
One of the opposition groups is called the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North. The deputy leader, Yasser Arman, says he's been deported from Sudan with 2 of his colleagues. A statement from the SPLM North says the men were forced onto a military aircraft and taken to Juba, the capital of South Sudan. This will likely reinforce suspicions that the army isn't interested in a transition. The military says snap elections will be held early next year. But the opposition says more time is needed to remove the legacy of Omar al-Bashir. So is another showdown between Sudan's protesters and paramilitaries inevitable? And will violence derail people's hopes for a democratic future? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Sydney is Ahmed Maqlad. He's an opposition politician living in exile in Australia. In Washington, D.C. is Muhammad Abu Bakr. He's the president of the human rights advocacy group, the Amal Project. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Ahmed Maqlad, let me start with you. Terrible things are happening on the streets right now. More than 100 people have been killed, many bodies chucked into the Nile, hundreds injured, paramilitaries. There's evidence that they've been raping tens of people or dozens of people. Is this something that the army is endorsing and supporting, or is it just a situation where they're unable to keep the paramilitaries under control?
Well, thank you for having me. The army, you got to talk about 2 sides of the army. The leaders that are chosen by the Omar al-Bashir, the previous president, the ex-president, or the rest of the army. What we have seen in the streets, that the army, the real people in the army that we know, they've been crying with us. they had no options to react. The leaders now in the military council are actually making one team with the what so-called Hemeti forces, which is known to the international community, which is known to the International Criminal Court, which is known to the American government, that it's an outlaw militias, nothing more, nothing less. The leaders now decided to make a coup out of this protest, and actually they did that, and they're just committing all these horrible things on the name of protecting the country. And it's not, they're not two separate things. They hijacked the military rule in a way.
Right. Okay. So Mohammed Abu Bakr, if they have hijacked the military rule and they are making these decisions, if we consider the deep state or the former Bashir allies who are deliberately trying to set the place ablaze and undermine the protests, what's their end goal? What do they want to happen?
I agree that what happened in Sudan by the military council, which is to be separated from the army as a whole. It's a transitional military council that includes non-army forces, that includes the RSF or the Janjaweed militia. And it was the crackdown was a premeditated crime. There is no way around that. They shut down Al Jazeera the night before. They cut down the internet. They were intent on committing a massacre, and they did. What they would like to see the deep state and the former regime of al-Bashir is protection from persecution for the crimes committed in the last 30 years. And they will do whatever in their power to make sure that a civilian majority government is not reached between the TMC and the opposition parties. And they will set they're setting the streets ablaze through Hemeti and his forces is no more than a desperate attempt to prevent the inevitable, which is a complete transition of power to a civilian rule,
right,
and a complete persecution of all criminals.
But you say
of
that,
the former
Mohammed,
regime,
allow me to come in
all
here,
the talking heads.
and I'm sorry to interrupt you. You say they're trying to prevent the inevitable, but is it really the inevitable? Because if we consider that it's highly likely that Hemeti has the support of the Egyptians, of the Saudis, of the Emiratis, he's got a lot of confidence that he might be able to succeed here and that Sudan might not reach the democratic freedom that you hope for. So it might not be inevitable. Have you thought of that?
Absolutely have been, and have been keeping a close eye on the development around Sudan long before December. The trouble for the TMC, the Rapid Response Force, the NCP, and Saudi Arabia and Egypt is that this uprising has been too principled to fight the way they know how to fight. For example, both sides of the Islamist movement has been rejected by the protesters very openly, and a call is for a civilian government that is not religious, that is not military influenced. And that makes it impossible to prosecute opposition on the basis of fighting terrorism, for example, like Sisi did in Egypt. And at the same time, they rejected violence as an option completely and categorically, and that makes it impossible to take an Assad approach to cracking down on the opposition.
Right. Okay.
And that is, again, very hard to deal with for the TMC. They know how to deal with violent protesters. They don't know how to deal with civil disobedience. Okay. That is way too hard to fight. And as far as Saudi and Emirates, their interest is simple. They want supply for their war in Yemen. A supply of child soldiers from this militia is all they want. And at some point, there will come a point when defending Hemeti and its regime will become way too costly, more costly than fighting their own war in Yemen, and they will have to cease and desist. And this is the inevitable I'm talking about. Sooner or later, the transitional military council will find itself in a losing war where staying in power is absolutely more costly than resigning. And that is inevitable for me.
Okay, happy to inform you that we're joined now by Rabi Abdel Obaid, who was with the former government, the deposed government of Omar al-Bashir. He joins us now in the discussion. Good to have you back on the program. Sir, you would have heard what Mohammed had to say. He believes that we're not going to see an Egypt outcome, we're not going to see a Syria outcome, and that the TMC is desperate in trying to crack down on those protesters now, and it's not going to work. Do you agree?
Yes, now I'm not speaking on behalf of National Congress Party. As I told you before, that National Congress Party has no existence now. Now, I'm speaking as a journalist and as also a former Director General of Sudan News Agency. I think now the situation in Sudan is going towards a civilian government, and we hope that within the coming few days, a prime minister to be actually appointed by the Transitional Military Council. And I think that also the civil disobedience will not succeed for the coming days, because there is actually now a sign of a successful the work of all people that working in the private sector and in the public sector, and all the services now are working properly, especially water supply, electricity, and also all institutions that belonging to the government that working properly. And I don't think that the civil disobedience will have any successful degree in the coming few days.
Ahmed Maglad, civil disobedience is not working, it's not going to work, and the general strike won't force the hand of the military. That's the opinion of Rabi Abdel Obaid. What do you think, Ahmed?
If it's not working, why are they cutting the internet? Why are they giving him internet in his office and cutting it from the rest of Sudan? He's part of this rule, whatever his name, whatever his position. But anyways, if it is not successful, why are they cutting the internet? Why? What they do hide from the world? What are they hiding from the world? The killing? Or what they're going to kill more? Or what they're going to do more in Sudan? Well, let him answer that question if he can. Well, it's obviously those who are with the protest or those who are not or against the protest, they all agree that it is one of the most successful disobediences in the world. This is a great, agreement between the Sudanese people. It's never happened before, and it is more than successful. He just, trying to say the same words that he's used, he memorized since he was working with al-Bashir, and he will continue doing that. But anyways, just let him answer one question. If it is not successful, why your leader, Hemeti himself, was asking for us to stop?
Okay.
Why?
Okay, so let's get him to answer the question. Okay, fair enough. Rabi?
Yes, actually, I am not now pro with the Hemeti or with the Transitional Military Council, but now I am trying to describe the situation, the political scene in front of my eyes. Now, all services are working, and electricity supply, there is no interruption. There is no interruption in water supply. There is no, and also the majority of governmental institutions are working as normal. That is why I think that this civil disobedience will not succeed. This is according to me and according to evaluation, what is in front of my eyes. And once again, I can stress upon that. I am not pro with this Transitional Military Council, but actually the people during the past 2 days, they felt a lot of harm due to the roadblocks, and as we know that the majority of Sudanese people, especially in the capital Khartoum, they are depending on their small business, and this small business actually affected negatively during the past 2 days due to the roadblocks that actually adopted by the Freedom and Change movement.
Muhammad Abu Bakr, I know you want to come in.
Yeah, I mean, old habits die hard, it seems. Despite not having an official title with the government, Mr. Abdulati seems to not have changed any of his old ways of coming on camera to give alternative facts. It's not really surprising at all. Electricity and water were never a target of the civil disobedience. Nobody ever had any plans of interrupting these services or interrupting any service that is vital to or important to the average citizen of Sudan. That was never the point, and it's still not the point. On the other hand, he claims that life is normal. Life is not normal by any measures. The life in Sudan is stopped as usual. The airport right now is operating with a staff that has been imported from Egypt. Banks are closed, most of them, except Bank Umdurman and a few other branches that are still operational. And the streets are still empty. As of half an hour ago, I was streaming a live video via satellite from fellow activists in Sudan who were showing me the most dense areas of Khartoum that are usually the most dense areas of Khartoum, and they are empty as it can get. And the claim of Mr. Abdulati that the civil disobedience is not working and is not going to work is simply a wishful thinking. It's working. The army has been freaking out and have been calling on people with loudspeakers to come and resume life as usual, and people just are disobeying. It is working. It's not 100% working, and no civil disobedience in history was 100%, but it's working enough to make the army concerned enough to not want to reopen the internet. All of this organizing happened without internet, and that is really impressive. All this organizing happened using text message and calls, which I expect the military will try to crack down on next. Right. And all the attempts to make it fail have failed so far. Okay. So Mr. Abdulati is merely making wishes here, and I'm not really surprised.
Big picture, Rabi Abdulati, do you support the rights of the protesters?
Yes, actually, he is trying to interpret this, what I said negatively also. Actually, I am seeking for stability in our country, and I think that the situation is not actually the situation which we require, because now definitely this civil disobedience will affect the services, but I think that the only solution for the stability in our country and for reconciliation between different political factions is to come to the table of negotiation and to forget about all grievances. And this is actually the only solution for the coming period, which we will call it the interim period. And if we will not go according to this actually strategy, our country will follow the same situation that which we will not require.
Rabi,
that situation which
I don't like to interrupt because there's and I apologize for interrupting. I don't like to interrupt because there's a 4-second delay between us, right? So this is possibly going to be a little bit choppy and annoying to our viewers as well because of the audio delay. But I need to ask, you're saying the protesters need to put aside all grievances, but when more than 100 have been killed and their bodies have been chucked into the Nile and dozens of them have been raped by paramilitary forces, can you honestly say those people need to say, yes, I have no grievances with the Transitional Military Council or the Janjaweed, I'm totally open to just have talks with no preconditions?
Actually, I don't have the I don't have the information about those people who are dropped in the River Nile and those people who killed. Actually, this is actually I don't accept. I don't accept all these that result of removing those people who are sit in front of the military command. But we are speaking now about the future, about the stability of our country, about the stable political system, and about reconciliation between different political parties. This is for the sake of Sudan people and for the sake of the future of the
I've asked you something very
generation.
directly that's been widely reported, and this is one of the main reasons that we are doing this segment right now. We're looking at the sit-in. We have the deportation of opposition leaders such as Yasser Arman to South Sudan. We've had people being killed. We've had credible reports of people's bodies being dumped into the Nile and credible reports from the hospitals of dozens of people being raped. I'm saying this is being done by the paramilitaries under the watch of the military, and you're telling the protesters, forget about all of that, let's just come to the table and have stability and reconciliation. Doesn't that sound as if you're from another planet? Okay, it seems as if we've lost the audio of Rabi, because I'm terribly annoyed that I didn't get him to respond to that. Ahmed Maghlad, just before we leave, final thoughts from you. And we're going to have all three of you back on the program again in the coming weeks and months, because clearly the story is not going to go away anytime soon. But final thoughts from you, Ahmed.
We say in our own language, the last word and the first word is for the Sudanese people. Today we witness knowledge against ignorance. We witness peaceful protest and peaceful movement against military and militias rule. I believe with no doubt, looking into the history, that we will succeed. Now or in the near future, we will succeed.
Ahmed Maghlad, Mohammed Abu Bakr and Rabi Abdul Ati Obaid, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Coming up on the Newsmakers, hundreds arrested in Kazakhstan after the country elects its first new president in 30 years. Was the vote valid or just the veneer of democracy? And it was one of the biggest protests in Hong Kong's history. But will it be enough to stop a controversial extradition law? Earlier this year, Nursultan Nazarbayev shocked Kazakhstan when he announced he was stepping down after 30 years in power. A snap election was called and Nazarbayev's hand-picked successor won pretty convincingly. But thousands in the country are refusing to accept Kassym-Jomart Tokayev as their leader. Opponents of Nazarbayev called the election a sham and urged their supporters to protest. They did, and hundreds were arrested. So, while Kazakhstan has its first new president in 3 decades, how much has really changed in the country? Melinda Nusifora has more.
The Kazakhstan government had promised a smooth transition of power, yet Sunday's presidential election was anything but peaceful. In a country where critics say free speech and political opposition are largely stifled, protests like these aren't common. Thousands of disgruntled voters defied police and, for days, rallied in cities across the country. They called the election a farce and an affront to democracy. The Minister of Internal Affairs says at least 500 people have been arrested in the demonstrations.
We are tired of what our government is doing. They try to shut us up. We don't have freedom of speech at all. It feels like we're slaves. We are not a free country.
Our elections are fake. They are not legitimate.
And it seems some international observers agree.
Having observed the entire election process so far, we can conclude that a lack of respect for fundamental freedoms and widespread voting irregularities on election day left the potential for political reform untapped.
An electoral victory for this man was widely considered a foregone conclusion. Kasim Jomart Tokayev was handpicked by his predecessor, Nursultan Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan's first and only other president. The former leader ruled for 3 decades since the country gained independence during the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Мен Қазақстан Республикасының президенті ретінде өкілеттігімді тоқтату жөнінде шешім қабылдадым.
That announcement shocked the nation. But he appointed his ally, Tokayev, as interim leader and snap elections were called. Tokayev won with more than 70% of the vote.
Азаматтарымыз өз конституциялық құқығын пайдаланып, сайлау учаскелеріне барып, дауыс беруде. Бұл халқымыздың жарқын болашағы үшін таңдау.
Opposition political parties say they've long been suppressed in Kazakhstan, and some critics have accused the government of trying to pass off its supporters as political rivals, including them on the ballot paper to give the impression of democracy. It's an accusation the new president denies, and he remains unapologetic about the use of force against protesters.
Некоторые граждане вели себя недостойно, провоцировали сотрудников полиции. Естественно, со стороны полиции были предприняты необходимые меры.
With only their second president since independence, disillusioned residents say they fear the more things change in Kazakhstan, the more they stay the same. Melinda Nusafora, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Almaty is Sergjan Membatilin. He's a politician with the opposition party New Kazakhstan Forum. Joanna Lillis is a journalist and author of the book Dark Shadows Inside the Secret World of Kazakhstan. And in Brussels, we have human rights lawyer and Kazakh political refugee Bota Jardemali. I thank you all for joining us on The Newsmakers. Good to have you on the program. Bota, let me start with you. So, Tokayev won. He got more than 70% of the vote. Did he earn that right to become president?
I think that these were sham elections, and they've been stolen from the outset in advance, because Nazarbayev, as he confessed, he's been preparing for these elections for 3 years, this transit of power. So they erected these barriers, legal, practical barriers, that were not allowed any independent candidate to be actually nominated, or any opposition candidate to participate in this process. So the process itself was run by a relative of Nazarbayev, Sergei Kimashev, who is the head of Central Election Commission, and Nazarbayev controlled every stage of the electoral process. So I don't think this is a true victory for Tokayev. This is actually sham elections.
So, Sergjan, you supported a candidate in this election, Amirjan Kosanov. That was your man.
Yes, I
did. So was your candidate running in a sham election where he knew he was never going to win?
Yeah, we expected this sort of elections, but it's Kazakh-type elections, long ahead of the schedule, but we get used to it. It's a very tough requirements to get registered for the candidate, but Amirjan Kosanov did it successfully because he is a 40-plus-year-old. He's been on the governmental service for 5 years. He's a prominent journalist, speaking Russian Kazakh fluently, and he's been living for 15 years. And he was nominated by the nationwide movement called Ultardare, because Forum of Jana Kazakhstan was not registered, although in spite of the fact that we started registration last year, and we didn't have any opposition party to nominate him.
Sergjan, there are those who say that even the opposition candidates were fake, and even they were part of the sham.
I don't think so. I don't think so. This candidate was a opposition candidate run first time since 2005. So we did our best. We started his election campaign since last year when we visited Brussels on the 8th of April, and we visited Washington, D.C., and we get a sort of rally for the several regions in Kazakhstan with the political program of Amirjan Kosanov. So we were fully prepared. We've been fully prepared, but not this preparation was not orchestrated by the government or the authority.
If you knew, sorry to interrupt you, if you knew that this was how it was going to turn out, why did you bother in the first place? Tell me how much value you could have gotten out of this.
Now, the thing is that although this election were faked by the mass falsification, as we have to admit, we didn't consider Amirjan Kasanov as a just opposition candidate. He was a vocal voice of the thousands and millions of protesters in Kazakhstan who are fed up with the current policy of the outgoing President Nazarbayev and his successor, President Tokayev. So his 16% he get on this election is just like a tiny piece of anti-rating of the existing elite, of the existing power, which has been represented by the President Nazarbayev and the President Tokayev. So we realized that it will be not so easy to get through. Actually, I was not even sure that we can register our candidate, but we did it. We succeeded, but the election was stolen as usual.
Joanna, that 16% was worth it for the reasons outlined by Serekjan, that it was worth competing just in order to get that message out there. Do you accept that? Do you buy that?
Well, it's not about whether I buy it or not. It's about whether the voters of Kazakhstan buy it. And I have to say that I've been talking to a lot of voters during the election campaign, and certainly since after the results were released yesterday. And I can tell you that Kasanov's voters are not buying it now. Many of the ones I've spoken to are very disappointed. They were happy to buy the idea that it's worth being in the election, even though they believed he toned down his criticism of the authorities in order to stand. And some believe he's cut a deal in order to have some political representation, perhaps in parliament later. But when Kasanov conceded victory, even though many of his supporters believe he got much a greater share of the vote, and also Kasanov's failure to rigorously condemn the arrest of 700 protesters on election day and on the day after the elections has disappointed many of the people who voted for him, and that's what they're telling me here in Almaty today and yesterday.
Okay, Serekjan, why didn't Kasanov condemn the arrests of more than 700 people?
We see all the arrests, all the detention, all the peaceful protesters, but the thing is that the outgoing elite they're trying to keep their power, and they can do everything they want to with any politician who can go against them. So I personally spent 5 months in a prison just for mere post on the Facebook. I was deprived from the Kazakh citizenship. I was and now I'm a British passport holder. So you can imagine, maybe, most probably, he was threatened to death, because when you look at his video posted on the night of election day, when he recognized the victory of President Tokayev, he looked like a very, very scared person. So that's what I can say. I haven't told him, I haven't spoken him to by far, but tomorrow I'm going to meet him and to get another details of this conversation.
Okay, great, and maybe we'll follow up with you to find out if he says anything of interest and have you back on the program. But
yes,
we have Serekjan trying to thread the needle here, saying that, okay, clearly the system's broken, it's imperfect, they falsified and they stole the election, but it's still worth playing the game and trying to work within it and try to battle within it. Do you accept that argument? Is it a fight worth fighting?
First of all, I want to make a comment about Serekjan Kasanov being a real candidate on behalf of the opposition. There were 6 candidates carefully selected by the regime to make sure that to guarantee the victory of Kassam-Jomart Tokayev, and they needed to create this appearance of this facade of democratic elections. So we have communist, we have a so-called opposition, and we have a first female candidate, right? And few extras, people that virtually unknown in Kazakhstan. And also, Serikjan mentioned, Kasanov has some credentials as a member of the opposition, but he's still virtually unknown in the country, because in this country, opposition members really not that known and don't have access to any publicly state-controlled media, etc. And obviously, the person who doesn't have like a platform behind him of a major political party could not collect signatures within 3 days, and it's required more than 100,000 signatures in support, and he collected that within from all over Kazakhstan, and he allegedly collected it within 3 days, although there were no pictures on Facebook showing how those signatures were collected. And I have to say that this comment is actually goes to every candidate. We don't know, there are no proofs that actual signatures were collected by all 7 candidates around the country. Then whether it's worth participating in this system. We have so-called opposition political parties, as I said, fake communist party, fake opposition party as Akjol that has few seats in the parliament, etc., etc. We've been told for the last 30 years that the opposition should be constructive, that they should work with the existing government and kind of in an orderly manner. We are talking in the country where a person gets arrested only for holding an empty poster, right? Or there was a case when a girl put a picture with an invisible poster on Facebook and got detained, right? So this is in the country where the landscape is actually
I see.
Doesn't have any real opposition. So I don't think it's possible to negotiate anything. And when Tokayev comes into power, I don't think it's going to be any better.
Serikjan?
I disagree in a certain extent with the Boto, because we've been preparing for more than 1 year, as I told you. Another issue that we have collected all the signature within 5 or 6 days. And unlike the rest of the candidates, we gathered all this signature even on the streets of Almaty. So there are a lot of pictures on people just signing the papers on the streets in Almaty, and I think Joanna has evidenced it. The thing is that there are several reasons of Mr. Kasanov was registered. One of them, I was told that it's a theory, but one of them is that a Russian politechnologist was invited to Astana to orchestrate these elections, and maybe they suggested to let opposition candidate to participate on these elections, like in Russia, Putin and Sobchak. Sobchak was a independent candidate. She is a journalist as well, and she was playing as a independent candidate, not an opposition, obviously, but independent. So this might be the recipe, yeah. So maybe this might be the biggest mistake, because the participating of the independent candidate like Amirjan Kasanov has just indicated the real level of support to the existing authority, and they were shocked that no one is going to support the newly elected president, because majority, based on our observation, I have to admit that the people were gathering voluntarily to be observers on this election. So it's sort of, we have a lot of evidences that Mr. Kasanov is a clear winner of this election.
Okay.
But surprisingly,
and this is why we find ourselves having this discussion, right? After an election, we have no real clear metrics to figure out who truly democratically won or what the people actually wanted. Joanna, big picture. Has anything really changed since Nazarbayev stepped down, or is he still pulling the strings?
Well, Nazarbayev's definitely still pulling the strings, and that's by law. He has personal constitutional prerogatives to intervene in policy making and run the Security Council for the rest of his life. But when you're asking about, has anything really changed in the big picture? Yes, it has. What we've seen is a real outpouring of dissent that has been suppressed over so many years, pouring out onto the streets over the last few days. Now, public protest is quite rare in Kazakhstan. I think Bota just mentioned that once very recently a man was detained for holding up a blank piece of paper to test the limits of tolerance for freedom of expression. Briefly detained, I must add. But you can see on the screen now pictures of unrest in Almaty, the city where I am, the largest city and financial capital, and the capital, Nur Sultan, named after outgoing President Nur Sultan Nazarbayev. And we've seen, we've seen smallish demonstrations of a few hundred people. We've seen a very, very harsh reaction by the security forces. I personally witnessed many detentions in Almaty. I witnessed detentions of protesting pensioners being carried cross-state into police vans. I witnessed the detention of a man riding his bicycle home. Anyone in the vicinity was fair game. Now, that is a crackdown. But what's changing in the bigger picture is that protesters are becoming rather more emboldened. The political transition has brought frustrations to the fore, and they wanted a boycott of an election they believe was micromanaged. They didn't believe that any of the candidates were real opposition candidates, and they also want a political voice in Kazakhstan's future, and they're not being offered that, with Nur Sultan Nazarbayev continuing to pull the strings and everything pre-decided from above.
Okay, well, we're paying attention and keeping a close eye on Kassym-Jomart Tokayev's time in power and what's happening on the streets and how the government reacts. For the moment, I have to move on, but it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Joanna, Sarikjan and Bota, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Next week, Hong Kong's lawmakers will vote on whether to approve a controversial extradition bill. The proposed law would allow criminal suspects to be sent to mainland China for trial, and that has so many of the territory's residents worried it brought possibly up to 1 million people onto the streets on Sunday to condemn it. Demonstrators say the proposed bill would not only allow Beijing to target its political opponents, but also compromise Hong Kong's own judicial system. However, Chief Executive Carrie Lam is unmoved. But with strikes and more protests planned, will she fold? We'll discuss that in a moment. But first, here's a look at what was one of Hong Kong's biggest ever demonstrations. I'm joined now by Anson Chan. She was Hong Kong's chief secretary, both under the last British colonial government and then under China's rule following the handover. Good to have you on the Newsmakers, ma'am. This extradition bill that they're going to be voting on next week, and when we look at all the revisions as well, is it a sign of things to come with regards Hong Kong's role and China's designs on Hong Kong?
I sincerely hope not. 1 million Hong Kong people took to the streets last Sunday in an attempt to urge our government to withdraw these very controversial extradition proposals. What people fear is that anyone here can be the subject of an extradition request. And once that person is sent across to mainland China, we know from everything we see of what goes on in mainland China that he or she will not receive a fair and open trial, because in the mainland, you have trumped-up charges, you have arbitrary arrests, and you have forced confession. So this is what is worrying Hong Kong people, because in Hong Kong, we enjoy the rule of law and civil liberties and personal safety. In fact, ever since the handover, there has always existed a firewall between Hong Kong and the mainland, and it is essential that that firewall remains in place.
Carrie Lam says there are safeguards in place. Hong Kong courts will have the opportunity to review individual decisions. Why don't you buy that?
No, despite the safeguards and the promises that the chief executive has made, we all know that these are empty promises, because once a person is sent across the border, the chief executive doesn't have the power to intervene. So, in other words, the person sent across will be subject to the dictates of the Communist Party, because we know that judicial organs in the mainland have to take their instructions from the Communist Party.
As you mentioned, more than 1 million people protested. The important question is, will the government listen to those people?
I think the chief executive, particularly as she is not popularly elected and does not have the political mandate to govern, I think she would do well to listen to the voices of the Hong Kong people. It is still not too late for the Hong Kong government to withdraw these proposals pending a proper public consultation, and in the light of that consultation, to come up with proposals that are more acceptable to the people of Hong Kong and that will ultimately address whatever problem we face at the moment.
Okay, and let's take a broader look at the timeline here. Especially on this program, we've covered story after story, which seems to suggest that incrementally China is going to be swallowing up Hong Kong or taking away the autonomy of Hong Kong. So we've looked at the booksellers and their so-called kidnapping. We've looked at the Occupy Central movement and their leaders going into jail. Now we're seeing this extradition bill tabled, and the fact that perhaps political dissidents will be sent to Beijing and they'll disappear and Hong Kong will have no control over them. With all of this in mind, is there an inevitability to Hong Kong losing its special status?
I think you are absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that it's a whole sequence of events in the recent years that make people afraid that one country, two systems is rapidly becoming one country, 1.5 system. And if this erosion continues, it will very soon become one country, one system. So you refer to the abduction of booksellers in Hong Kong, or because they wrote salacious articles about people in the top hierarchy. We've seen the expulsion of a highly respected journalist from the Financial Times. We've seen disqualification of Legislative Council members, imprisonment of the young activists, and even political judgment creeping into deciding who can or cannot stand for election. So these set of extradition proposals, in the eyes of many Hong Kong people, particularly the young, who faces a very bleak future, is the last straw. And that is why so many people of all walks of life and of all ages took to the streets, because they want to show the world that their voice can and should be heard.
It's been 22 years since the handover. You were there, and that's why it's a privilege to talk to you. You were there, you were at the table with the Chinese, with the British, with all the key stakeholders, yes. And you were a key stakeholder yourself.
I was indeed, yes.
So with all of that in mind now, 22 years on, do you have any regrets? Do you maybe feel that you were perhaps too trusting of the Chinese, too hopeful of the fact that they might just leave you alone?
I remember in the run-up to the handover and in the immediate years after the handover, I went overseas to all our main trading partners to help sell the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, and to tell people to be assured that everything will be well in Hong Kong, and that other than a change of flag and a change of sovereign power, everything else about Hong Kong will remain the same. i.e., we will continue to enjoy the rule of law, have an independent judiciary, all our basic rights and freedoms, and a squeaky clean civil service. Now, I did this in good faith. My greatest regret is to see how fast the erosion into one country, two systems has been, particularly at the increasingly blatant interference from Beijing and from its local representative office, the liaison office. But I think it is very essential for Hong Kong people to stand up and fight, for our chief executive to be on the side of Hong Kong people to defend one country, two systems. But equally important, the international community must continue to keep Hong Kong on its radar and to speak out when one country, two systems is being eroded, because they have a genuine stake in Hong Kong and in the faithful implementation of one country, two systems. It is, after all, an internationally binding treaty.
If you had an audience with Xi Jinping right now, what would you tell him?
I would say to Mr. Xi Jinping, the best thing you can do in terms of ensuring that Hong Kong can continue to make a unique contribution to the sustainable long-term economic growth of our country is to leave us alone to get on with the implementation of one country, two systems. You must allow us to keep our strengths, and our strengths rest on the foundation of rule of law, basic rights and freedoms, a high degree of autonomy, and Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong.
Many of those protesters are asking for the chief executive, Carrie Lam, to step down. Do you want her to step down?
I think that the chief executive would do well to listen to the voices of the million people who were out on the streets last Sunday. She faces a real crisis, and if she does not listen and continue to insist on bulldozing her proposals through a very compliant legislative council, then I'm afraid she will find it increasingly difficult to govern Hong Kong in the remaining 3 years of her tenure of office.
Interestingly put. Ma'am, it's been a pleasure having you on The Newsmakers. Anson Chan, thank you very much for joining us. And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Algeria cancels its July the 4th election. Are we seeing a return to the not-so-distant days of Abdelaziz Bouteflika? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.